At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Mizpah, watching black clouds of flak explode across the sky over Budapest. 24 years old, 17 combat missions, zero margin for error. The Luftwaffe had positioned more than 288mm flak guns around the railway yards below, and they were all firing. Swanson's B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sturparone, Italy. The mission was simple on paper: strike the Shell oil refinery and railway yards in the heart of German-controlled Budapest, cut the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, get home. But by July of 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force knew the statistics. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, 8 would not return home. Some would die, some would be captured, some would simply disappear. The formation pressed forward through the curtain of flak. Shells burst in black puffs that could shred aluminum like paper. Mizpah took hits in the tail section, then the wings. Shrapnel punched holes through the fuselage, but the bombers stayed in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew held their positions. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt sat in the co-pilot seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the compartment beside him. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft: radio operators, gunners, the flight engineer. Seconds away from the target, Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of high explosive dropped toward the railway yards below. The B-17 lurched upward as the weight fell away. Then an 88mm shell hit the nose of the aircraft. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire front section of Mizpah vaporized. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator position, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass panels. Everything forward of the cockpit simply ceased to exist. Dudley died instantly. Henderson died instantly. The blast wave tore through what remained of the aircraft. The metal structure that had housed 2 men and thousands of pounds of equipment was gone. The center of gravity shifted backward. With no weight in the nose, Mizpah pitched up into a near vertical climb. The bomber began to stall. Swanson could see sky where instruments should have been. Cold air at 30,000 feet screamed through the open cavity. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. Wind tore at his flight suit. Blood from the explosion covered the flight deck. Through the gap where the nose had been, Swanson could see the formation continuing toward the rally point. There was no control column. The yoke that connected to the flight control system had been mounted to the forward structure. That structure no longer existed. There were no instruments. The panel had been attached to the nose section. That was gone too. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, no way to know what the aircraft was doing except by feel and by looking at the horizon through the massive hole in front of him. But the control cables were still there. The steel cables that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They were exposed now, hanging in the wind, but they were intact. Swanson forced the B-17's nose down. He did not know how. There was nothing to push, nothing to pull, but somehow he got the aircraft level. Somehow he got it back into loose formation with the group. The bomber should have been unflyable. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 with inherent stability, but no engineer had planned for this. No manual covered flying without a cockpit. The only thing keeping Mizpah in the air was physics and desperation. If you want to see how Swanson's crew pulled those bare cables to stay airborne, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Swanson. Behind him, the surviving crew members began moving forward. The radio operator, the flight engineer. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay. They could see the wind tearing through the aircraft. They understood what had to happen next. Over 200 flak guns were still firing. The formation was still over enemy territory, and another shell was about to hit engine number 2. The second 88mm shell struck engine number 2 at 9:44 a.m. The right cyclone radial engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments. Flames streamed back along the inboard nacelle on the left wing. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds, then seized. Engine number 2 was dead. Mizpah now had 3 engines instead of 4. The bomber began losing airspeed. The formation was pulling ahead. Without the cockpit instruments, Swanson had no way to measure how fast they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Graminzi, the flight engineer, made his way forward from the top turret position. He could see the problem immediately. The control cables ran through the fuselage in bundles: elevator cables, rudder cables, aileron cables. They were steel wire rope, each about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Normally, they were enclosed in pulleys and fair leads, hidden behind panels and structure. Now they were completely exposed. The wind was pulling at them. Without someone physically holding the cable steady, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Simonelli moved up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They positioned themselves near the bomb bay, where the main cable runs were visible. There was no discussion, no debate. The situation was obvious. Someone had to hold these cables. Someone had to pull them when Swanson needed control input. The problem was coordination. Swanson was sitting in what remained of the cockpit, 40 feet forward. The crew was standing in the bomb bay area. The intercom system was damaged. Communication would be nearly impossible. Swanson tried moving the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still attached to the floor, but the cables they normally actuated were now being buffeted by 300-mile-per-hour wind. He tried the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That was something. But without control over the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation and into a dive. Or worse, it would pitch up again, stall, and spin. Either way, everyone would die. The crew began pulling. They wrapped sections of cable around their hands for grip. The steel was cold. It cut into their gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, Mizpah's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators worked the same way. Pull back, the nose came up. Release, it dropped. The problem was that every input had to be perfectly timed. Too much pressure, and the aircraft would over-respond. Too little, and nothing would happen. And they were doing this without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, without instruments or indicators. Mizpah continued falling behind the formation. The other B-17s were maintaining their cruise speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's bomber was slower now. The drag from the missing nose section was enormous. The destroyed engine meant less power, and the formation was not waiting. They could not wait. Every minute over Hungary meant more exposure to fighters and flak. The standard procedure was clear. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., Mizpah was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2 miles. Swanson could see them in the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the summer sky. His own aircraft was losing altitude. Not quickly, but steadily. They had been at 30,000 feet over the target. Now they were at 29,000, then 28. The crew kept pulling cables. Their hands were cramping. The cold was brutal. Blood circulation was being cut off by the pressure of the steel against their palms. But they kept pulling. The fuel situation was unknown. The gauges were gone with the instrument panel. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. He had no idea how long 3 engines could keep them airborne. He had no idea if they were even heading in the right direction. Navigation required instruments. It required a map. It required the navigator, who was now dead somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson knew was southwest. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Get to the Adriatic. Get to Italy. Get home. Then the crew in the bomb bay started waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson could not turn around to look. The wind pressure through the open nose cavity made any movement dangerous. If he unbuckled from the pilot seat, he could be pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in position, watching the horizon, trying to keep the wings level. But the crew kept waving. Something was wrong in the rear section. Something beyond the missing nose, beyond the dead engine, beyond the exposed control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail section was the most isolated spot on a B-17, a small compartment at the very back of the fuselage, accessible only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the impact. He had felt the aircraft pitch up violently. He had felt it stabilize. But now he was feeling something else. The tail structure was flexing. The metal framework that held the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it should not move. The explosion had created stress fractures somewhere in the fuselage. Or shrapnel had weakened critical support members. Either way, the tail section was beginning to fail. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. A B-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin. The aircraft would tumble end over end until it disintegrated or hit the ground. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood this. They could see the tail gunner's position through the fuselage. They could see the structure moving, and they had no way to fix it. Mizpah was now at 26,000 feet, still descending, still heading southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Every second felt like an hour. The wind noise was deafening. The cold was penetrating every layer of his flight suit. His hands on the throttles were going numb. But the throttles were the only controls he had left. Engine power was the only thing he could adjust without help from the crew pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt, the co-pilot, was still in his seat. His control column was gone too. His instruments were gone. But he was watching the wings, watching the engines, watching for fighters. German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted lone bombers. A damaged B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target. No defensive firepower from neighboring aircraft, no mutual support. Just one crippled bomber losing altitude over enemy territory. But so far, no fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or had not spotted Mizpah yet. The crew kept pulling cables. Their coordination was improving. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft wanted to yaw right. The crew compensated by pulling left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again. It was not flying. It was collective survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 a.m., Mizpah crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson did not know this. He had no map, no landmarks he could identify through the gaping hole where his cockpit used to be. But the flak stopped. The black clouds of explosions ceased. That meant they were out of the heaviest defensive zones. That meant they might have a chance. A small chance. A chance that depended entirely on how long the tail structure would hold together. How long the crew could keep pulling cables. How long 3 engines could generate enough thrust. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines. He could feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly. That meant fuel was still flowing. That meant the wing tanks were not empty yet. But how much remained was impossible to know. B-17s carried 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks. At cruise power, 4 engines burned roughly 200 gallons per hour. But they were not at cruise power. They were at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, trying to maintain altitude and airspeed. That meant fuel consumption was higher. Much higher. Swanson made a decision. The decision was simple. Get the crew out. The aircraft was dying. The tail structure was failing. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over occupied territory. Every minute in the air increased the risk of total structural failure. If Mizpah broke apart at altitude, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would have a chance. They would be captured. They would spend months in prisoner of war camps, but they would be alive. The problem was execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required coordination. The standard procedure involved specific exit points. The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and others used the waist gun windows or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret to a specific position before climbing out. Each crew member had practiced this dozens of times in training, but training assumed the aircraft was intact. Training assumed the pilot could communicate over the intercom. Training assumed there was time to organize an orderly evacuation. Swanson had none of those things. He had no intercom. He had no way to give the order. He had no way to coordinate who went first and who went last, and he could not leave his position. The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull. The B-17 would enter a dive or a spin within seconds. Everyone still aboard would die. At 9:52 a.m., Mizpah was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were locked on the throttles. His feet were on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals did nothing without the crew pulling cables 30 feet behind him. Burnt sat motionless in the co-pilot seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, watching for any sign of catastrophic failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. The wind noise made conversation impossible anyway. The crew in the bomb bay made the decision themselves. They could feel the tail structure flexing. They could see the stress cracks spreading through the fuselage skin. They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft came apart. One by one, they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped his parachute harness, positioned himself at the window opening, and jumped. The slipstream took him instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next, then Staff Sergeant George Simonelli, then Technical Sergeant Frank Grimenzi. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables meant less precise inputs. The B-17 began wallowing. The wings dipped left, then right. The nose pitched up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttle settings to compensate, but throttle alone was not enough. He needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the crew pulling cables. But the crew was abandoning ship. They had to. It was the only rational choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position. He squeezed through the narrow passage, emerged in the waist gun area, and saw the empty positions where his crewmates had been standing moments before. He saw the exposed control cables, now slack without hands holding them. He saw the massive opening where the nose used to be, 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated. 5 men were descending under parachute canopies over Yugoslavia. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours. But 5 men would survive the day. That left 5 men still aboard Mizpah. Swanson in the pilot seat, Burnt in the co-pilot seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached the exit points. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, still barely controllable, and the tail structure was about to fail completely. The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, waist gunner, went through the window opening. His parachute deployed cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. That left 3 men aboard: Swanson, Burnt, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable. With almost no one pulling the control cables, Mizpah was responding only to engine power and inherent aerodynamic stability. That stability was designed for normal flight conditions, not for flight without a nose section, not for flight with a failing tail structure. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped, and disappeared into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnt were alone. 2 men in the remains of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber was still descending. 3 engines were still running, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. It was barely staying in the air through a combination of residual stability and the fact that the wings were still generating lift. Without crew members pulling cables, any significant control input was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Burnt. No words were exchanged. The wind noise would have drowned out any conversation, but the message was clear. Burnt needed to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls. He had no function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or crashed. The only rational choice was to bail out while altitude remained, while there was still time to deploy a parachute and survive the landing. Burnt unbuckled his harness. He stood up from the co-pilot seat. He moved carefully toward the rear of the flight deck, where he could access the main fuselage and reach the waist gun exit. He looked back at Swanson one final time. The pilot was still locked in position, hands on throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as possible. Burnt climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and headed aft. 30 seconds later, He jumped. Ewald Swanson was alone, one man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was falling at approximately 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady descent. The three remaining engines were producing enough thrust to maintain forward speed, but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created massive drag. The aerodynamic profile was destroyed. The B-17 was essentially a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation remained unknown. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to tell. The engine sound gave no indication. Wright Cyclone engines ran smoothly until the fuel supply was completely exhausted, at which point they simply stopped. No warning, no sputtering, just silence. And if all three engines quit simultaneously, Mizpah would drop out of the sky. Swanson estimated his position. They had been flying southwest for approximately 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was probably around 180 miles per hour, maybe less. That meant they had covered roughly 40 miles, maybe 45. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was approximately 30 miles from Budapest. That meant they were likely over Yugoslavia now, possibly approaching the mountains, possibly approaching the Adriatic coast. But all of this was guesswork. Without instruments, without maps, without a navigator, he was flying blind. The question was how long to stay aboard. Every minute at the controls meant the crew below had more time to distance themselves from the crash site. German patrols would search for a downed bomber, but if Swanson could keep Mizpah flying for another few minutes, the crew members under parachutes would land miles away from where the aircraft eventually hit the ground. That separation could mean the difference between capture and evasion, between imprisonment and freedom. But staying aboard also meant increased risk of dying in the crash. The tail structure was still flexing. The bomber could break apart at any moment. And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit point, and jump. All while the B-17 was uncontrolled. All while it was potentially entering a death spiral. At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his final decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. That would give the crew more separation distance. That would give them a better chance. Then he would go. Swanson kept his hands on the throttles. The 3 Wright Cyclone engines continued their steady roar. Engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right wing, engine number 4 on the far right wing. All running smoothly, all consuming fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At 10 a.m. exactly, Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, he felt the wind pressure trying to pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose used to be. He pushed back against his seat, then stood up carefully. The aircraft immediately began to pitch. Without anyone controlling the throttles, without anyone making corrections, Mizpah started a gentle left roll. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck. He squeezed through the narrow crawlway that led to the bomb bay area. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped. The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay. Nobody was pulling them now. Nobody was holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive. He had maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before the G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft entered a spin. He reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor was vibrating under his boots. The wind noise was overwhelming. He grabbed his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening. The bomber was diving now. Not vertically, but steeply enough that Swanson had to brace himself against the fuselage to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked out at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical wall. The wind spun him sideways. The B-17 flashed past, engine still roaring, already 200 feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Then silence. Relative silence. The roar of the engines faded as Mizpah continued its dive. Swanson watched the bomber fall. The tail section was still attached, but barely. The entire rear fuselage was flexing like a reed in the wind. At 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The B-17's forward section pitched nose down almost vertically. It fell for another 8 seconds, then disappeared into a line of trees 2 miles away. A column of black smoke rose moments later. The fuel tanks had ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson had stayed aboard for another 30 seconds, he would be dead. The parachute descent was slow. Swanson drifted southwest with the prevailing wind. Below him, the Yugoslav landscape showed scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down there were German occupation forces. Somewhere down there were his crew members, who had jumped minutes before him. Somewhere down there was the reality that his war was over. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson could see trees. He tried to steer the parachute toward an open field, but the canopy was not designed for precision maneuvering. The trees were directly below him now. He hit the upper branches at approximately 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped. The parachute canopy caught on limbs. Swanson crashed through the foliage and slammed into a thick branch with his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped cleanly somewhere between the knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet and came to a stop, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches, 15 feet above the ground. Blood was running down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep lacerations covered his left thigh, where branches had cut through fabric and skin. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move it, could not put weight on it, could not climb down from the tree. He hung there, suspended in the parachute harness, trying to control the pain, trying to stay conscious. Below him, he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers arrived at the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of an occupation unit stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes descending. They had heard the crash of the B-17. Now they were collecting American aircrew. Swanson hung motionless in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, unable to move, unable to escape. One of the soldiers called up to him. Swanson did not respond. The soldiers began discussing how to get him down. They found a ladder from a nearby farm. 2 men climbed up and cut the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson carefully, trying not to worsen the leg injury. When they reached the ground, they laid him on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived. He examined the broken leg, the lacerations, the blood loss. He applied a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth. He injected morphine from a medical kit. The pain began to fade. Swanson felt the drug taking effect, dulling the sharp agony in his leg to a distant throb. The medic wrapped the deep cuts with bandages. He checked for other injuries. Ribs seemed intact, no head trauma, no internal bleeding that he could detect. The primary concern was the leg. Without proper treatment, infection would set in. Without surgery, the bone might not heal correctly. But for now, the medic had done what he could with limited supplies in a forest clearing. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post. From there, he was moved to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the fracture, and set the bone properly. The procedure was painful despite the morphine. Swanson passed out twice during the process. When he regained consciousness, his leg was in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. The doctor explained through an interpreter that the fracture was clean. The bone would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mizpah's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None had evaded capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan resistance groups operated in the mountains, but the crew had landed in farmland controlled by German forces. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Burnt, Gramenzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish. All alive. All uninjured except for minor cuts and bruises. All now prisoners of war. They were transported to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, a facility specifically designated for captured Allied aircrew. The camp housed approximately 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh, but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. The barracks were cold in winter. Medical care was minimal. But the Germans generally followed Geneva Convention protocols for officer prisoners. There were no mass executions, no systematic torture, just confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches. The cast came off in September of 1944. Physical therapy was basic. He walked around the camp perimeter every day, rebuilding strength in the damaged leg. By October, he could walk without assistance. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered. But the war continued. The camp remained locked. Guards patrolled the wire. Escape attempts were rare and mostly unsuccessful. The crew of Mizpah settled into the routine of captivity. They talked about the mission, about the 88mm shell, about the 10 minutes they flew without a cockpit, about pulling the control cables by hand, about watching their bomber fall into the Yugoslav forest, about Dudley and Henderson, who died instantly when the nose exploded, about how close they all came to dying that day. And they waited. Waited for the war to end. Waited for liberation. Waited to go home. Winter turned to spring. The Germans began evacuating camps as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions deteriorated. Food became scarce. Some men died during the forced marches. Others escaped in the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together. They marched through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. And on April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks rolled past. Soldiers distributed food, water, and cigarettes. Medical personnel checked for injuries and disease. The former prisoners were transported to collection points, then to airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually to the United States. The crew of Mizpah went home. All 8 survivors. All 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest. All 8 men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Ewald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he would say only that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a pilot who had done his job under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed. Swanson was promoted over the following years, eventually retiring as lieutenant colonel. The recognition was not for a single mission, but for a career of service. But that single mission remained the defining moment. The 10 minutes without a cockpit. The 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in contact. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. They gathered every few years to remember the war, the missions, the men who did not return. The bond between them was unbreakable. They had survived something that should not have been survivable. They had flown a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and bare control cables exposed to 300-mile-per-hour wind. They had done it through coordination, through determination, through the simple refusal to give up. And they had honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, stayed in Michigan near Swanson. They remained friends until the end. Frank Remenzi returned to his family and rarely discussed the war. George Simonelli kept photographs from the mission. He showed them to his grandchildren decades later, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while a bomber fell apart around you. The others scattered across the country, but they remembered. They all remembered. Ewald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He had lived a full life. He had seen the world change. He had seen aircraft evolve from propeller-driven bombers to jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mizpah. The B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest. The bomber that flew on borrowed time and crew determination. The aircraft that proved human will could overcome engineering limits. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Ewald Swanson and the crew of Mizpah don't disappear into silence. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when that 88mm shell hit. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never came home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory forward. For 9 months in a prisoner of war camp, for decades afterward in Michigan and across America. And now, through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.
October 1959, 320 nautical miles northeast of Iceland. The North Atlantic rolls dark and heavy under a moonless sky, swells driven by autumn storms that have battered the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap for 3 straight days. 200 feet below the surface, USS Amberjack hangs motionless in the thermal layer, her diesel engines silent, batteries providing just enough power to maintain depth and life support. Inside the control room, the air tastes of amine scrubber chemicals and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. Condensation beads on cold steel bulkheads, despite the best efforts of overworked ventilation systems. The overhead lights have been dimmed to preserve power. In the red glow of battle lanterns, 23 men work at their stations with the disciplined quiet of submariners who understand that sound is the difference between hunter and hunted. Second-class Petty Officer James Whitten has been on sonar watch for 6 hours and 14 minutes. His logbook records the monotonous litany of ocean background, distant merchant traffic transiting the Denmark Strait, biological noise from migrating whale pods, the rhythmic crash of surface wave action transmitted through hundreds of feet of seawater. Whitten wears the BQR-2B passive sonar headset with one ear cup slightly off-center, an old submariner's trick that allows him to hear both the hydrophone array and any urgent voice communication from the control room without removing the headset entirely. His eyes track the pale green waterfall display, watching for the vertical striations that would indicate propeller cavitation or machinery noise distinct from the ocean's natural symphony. At 0342 hours, something changes. A low-frequency mechanical rhythm appears in Whitten's headphones, faint but distinct. Not biologics, not merchant traffic with its characteristic higher-pitched screw wash. This is deeper, more deliberate, with the regular cadence that speaks of military-grade propulsion. Whitten's hand moves to the gain control, increasing sensitivity on the bearing where the contact has appeared. The signal strengthens. Definite mechanical origin. Twin screws turning at approximately 90 revolutions per minute. Course approximately 270 degrees, heading west-southwest toward the gap. Speed estimated 7 knots. Depth approximately 150 feet, based on acoustic propagation characteristics. Whitten keys his communication circuit. His voice is calm, professionally neutral, betraying none of the adrenaline spike that comes with detecting what might be hostile contact. Con, sonar, new contact, designated Sierra 1, bearing 352 degrees. Twin screws, mechanical signature, consistent with submarine. Range indeterminate, signal strength moderate. Contact appears to be transiting westbound. In the control room, Commander Thomas Harper straightens from the chart table, where he has been reviewing the patrol orders that brought Amberjack to this exact position at this exact time. Harper is 41 years old, a career submariner who enlisted in 1936 and earned his commission during the war. He has commanded Amberjack for 26 months, long enough to know every quirk of her guppy-converted systems. long enough to trust his crew's competence implicitly. He crosses to the sonar station in 4 strides, his rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the deck plates. Harper does not immediately speak. He stands behind Witten's station, watching the waterfall display, listening to the faint audio feed from the external speakers. 30 seconds of observation. Professional assessment. The signal is real. The bearing is stable. The acoustic characteristics match intelligence briefings. Harper studied during the pre-patrol briefing at Submarine Squadron 4 headquarters in Key West 3 weeks earlier. Soviet submarine, likely diesel-electric based on the machinery signature. The twin-screw configuration and the specific frequency range suggest a Zulu-class boat, possibly one of the 6 Zulu V variants that NATO intelligence suspects have been converted to carry ballistic missiles. Harper speaks quietly to his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Marsh, who has materialized at his elbow. "If that's what I think it is, we just won the intelligence lottery. Get the crew to tracking stations. Silent routine, no active sonar under any circumstances. We're going to follow this contact and see where he's going." The decision Harper has just made carries implications that extend far beyond Amberjack's pressure hull. The year is 1959, 14 years into the Cold War, 4 years after the Geneva summit had briefly promised détente, 2 years after Sputnik had shocked America into recognizing Soviet technological capability. The strategic landscape has shifted with terrifying speed. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev has publicly boasted that the Soviet Union is producing missiles like sausages, threatening to bury capitalism through superior industrial production. American intelligence agencies are desperate for hard information about Soviet naval capabilities, particularly regarding submarine-launched ballistic missiles that could strike American coastal cities with virtually no warning. The GIUK Gap, the choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, represents the most critical defensive line in the Atlantic. Any Soviet submarine transiting from northern fleet bases to the open Atlantic must pass through this relatively narrow corridor. American and NATO forces maintain persistent surveillance using a combination of long-range patrol aircraft, surface vessels, submarine patrols, and classified hydrophone arrays planted on the ocean floor. The mission is simple in concept, enormously complex in execution. Detect Soviet submarines attempting Atlantic transit, track them for as long as possible to gather intelligence on capabilities and operating patterns, photograph them when opportunities arise, and under no circumstances allow the Soviets to know they have been detected. USS Amberjack is perfectly positioned for exactly this mission, though her presence in the gap is not accidental. She is one of 52 American fleet submarines that have undergone guppy conversion between 1947 and 1963, transformed from World War II surface raiders into true underwater hunters, optimized for Cold War operations. The Guppy II modification that Amberjack received at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in 1947 had streamlined her hull, doubled her battery capacity from 252 cells to 504 cells, installed a snorkel system allowing diesel operation at periscope depth, and upgraded her sonar suite and fire control systems. The result is a submarine that can sustain 15 to 16 knots submerged for over an hour, or maintain slower speeds for days if necessary, all while generating far less acoustic signature than the first-generation nuclear submarines that are just beginning to enter service. Harper understands both the capabilities and the limitations of his boat, with the intimate knowledge that comes from 2 years of intensive operations. Amberjack can outrun most Soviet diesel-electric submarines in short sprints. Her streamlined guppy hull generates significantly less flow noise than traditional fleet boat configurations. When running on batteries with diesel engines secured, she is quieter than USS Nautilus or any of the early nuclear boats whose reactor cooling pumps create constant broadband noise. But batteries are finite. At current load with main engines secured and minimal hotel services, Harper has perhaps 18 to 20 hours of battery endurance before he will be forced to snorkel and recharge, exposing a mast above the surface and risking detection by radar or visual observation. The decision calculus is brutal in its simplicity. If Harper commits to tracking this Soviet submarine, he is betting Amberjack's entire battery capacity on the intelligence value of the contact. If the Soviet boat is merely a patrol submarine conducting routine transit, the intelligence gain might not justify the operational risk. But if this is one of the Zulu V missile boats that NATO desperately wants to photograph and characterize, 18 hours of tracking could provide intelligence worth millions of dollars in Cold War currency. Harper makes his choice in the 30 seconds it takes to cross from the sonar station back to the chart table. He will track. He will follow this Soviet submarine for as long as batteries allow, or until the contact demonstrates capabilities that definitively identify it as a strategic asset. And he will do it without being detected, because detection would not only end the tracking mission, but would also inform the Soviets that American submarines are capable of trailing them undetected through their home waters. An intelligence loss, potentially more damaging than any gain from identification. The crew understands what is happening without requiring detailed explanation. Amberjack's officers and enlisted men have trained for exactly this scenario through countless exercises. They know the procedures for silent running, battery conservation, passive tracking, and the psychological discipline required to maintain operations for extended periods without surfacing or transmitting. They settle into their stations with the calm professionalism of men who have volunteered for submarine duty precisely because it offers these moments: the silent hunt, the patient stalk, the invisible war fought in darkness where skill and determination matter more than brute technological superiority. Lieutenant Commander Marsh moves through the boat on silent routine, personally verifying that every piece of loose gear is secured, every unnecessary system is shut down, every potential noise source is eliminated. In the engine room, the massive Fairbanks-Morse diesel engines sit cold and silent, their warmth gradually dissipating into the surrounding seawater. The motor room hums with the subdued whine of electric drive motors pulling current from the battery banks, spinning the single propeller at minimal revolutions designed to maintain steerage while minimizing cavitation noise. In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes rest in their tubes, loaded and ready, but with firing solutions unentered, because Harper has no intention of shooting unless Amberjack faces imminent destruction. In the crew's mess, men who are not on watch lie in their bunks, trying to rest, but finding sleep difficult with the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness outside the hull, a Soviet submarine is moving through the same water. The galley is secured except for the coffee urn, which remains hot because submariners run on caffeine as much as they run on battery power. The smell of old coffee mixes with the ever-present odor of diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp chemical bite of the CO2 scrubbers working overtime to keep the atmosphere breathable. The tracking begins in earnest at 03:55 hours. Witten calls out bearing updates every 60 seconds as the Soviet submarine maintains steady course and speed. Harper positions Amberjack on a parallel course offset by approximately 4,000 yards, close enough for solid sonar contact, but far enough to minimize the risk of counter-detection if the Soviet sonarman is competent. The American boat settles into what submariners call the trail position, following slightly behind and to the side of the target, using the target's own noise to mask any sounds Amberjack might generate. The mathematics of underwater pursuit are unforgiving. Sound travels at approximately 1,500 meters per second in seawater, but the speed varies with temperature, salinity, and pressure. The seasonal thermal layer at 150 feet acts as a partial acoustic barrier, bending sound waves in ways that can either help or hinder detection, depending on the geometry of the pursuit. Harper keeps Amberjack slightly below the thermal layer, using it to shield his boat from any upward-looking sonar the Soviet submarine might employ, while still maintaining good signal strength on the downward propagating noise from the target's machinery. For the first hour, the pursuit is almost routine. The Soviet boat shows no indication of awareness that it is being followed. The bearing drift is consistent with a submarine on a planned navigation track, probably following a pre-briefed route through the gap designed to minimize exposure to known NATO surveillance assets. The contact maintains 7 knots, a speed that suggests battery conservation rather than urgency. This supports Harper's assessment that the Soviet captain believes himself undetected and is conducting a standard transit rather than an emergency run. Harper uses this stable period to establish baseline acoustic data. He has Witten document every characteristic of the target's sound signature, the blade rate of the propellers, the frequency of machinery vibrations, any harmonic overtones that might indicate specific equipment. This information will be valuable to American intelligence, even if visual identification later proves impossible. Each Soviet submarine has unique acoustic characteristics based on manufacturing tolerances, equipment installations, and maintenance history. Building a library of these signatures allows American forces to track individual boats across multiple deployments. At 0445 hours, 1 hour and 3 minutes into the pursuit, the first complication arises. A merchant ship appears on sonar, transiting north through the gap. The freighter's screws create a wall of noise that temporarily masks the Soviet submarine's signature. Witten loses the clean signal for 47 seconds, tracking only on bearing rate and historical data. Harper makes a quick decision, maintain course and speed, trusting Witten to reacquire contact when the merchant clears. The gamble pays off. As the freighter passes, the Soviet submarine's signature emerges from the noise exactly where Harper's dead reckoning predicted. But the incident highlights the fragility of the pursuit. Amberjack is tracking on passive sonar alone, which means she has no precise range to target. Harper knows the bearing, the direction to the Soviet boat, but the distance is estimated from signal strength and propagation characteristics. If the Soviet captain makes an unexpected maneuver during a period when Amberjack's sonar is masked by other noise, the American boat could lose contact permanently. The crew settles into the rhythm of extended operations. Watch sections rotate on a compressed schedule, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, which is exhausting but necessary to maintain alertness during the critical tracking mission. In the control room, Harper and Marsh trade off command responsibilities. One always present to make tactical decisions, while the other grabs brief rest periods in the tiny captain's cabin. Neither man sleeps deeply. The responsibility of command does not permit genuine rest during operations like this. By hour 2, the battery's state of charge has dropped to 87%. Harper updates his mental calculations. At current consumption rates, assuming no high-speed maneuvers are required, Amberjack can maintain pursuit for approximately 16 more hours before reaching minimum safe battery level. That minimum is not 0. Harper must reserve enough power to clear the area at high speed if detected, to reach a safe snorkeling position, and to defend the boat if attacked. Running batteries to absolute exhaustion would be suicidal. At 0520 hours, 4 hours and 38 minutes into the tracking mission, the character of the pursuit changes dramatically. The Soviet submarine executes a sharp turn to port, changing course by 45 degrees and simultaneously increasing speed to approximately 12 knots. The maneuver is abrupt enough that it cannot be explained by normal navigation. Either the Soviet captain is executing a pre-planned evasion route, or he has detected something that makes him suspicious. Witten's voice carries the first real tension since the tracking began. Con, sonar. Sierra 1 has altered course to port, new heading approximately 225 degrees. Speed increasing, estimate 12 knots. Blade rate increasing proportionally. Classify as possible evasive maneuver. Harper's jaw tightens. The decision tree has just become significantly more complex. If he orders Amberjack to follow the course change immediately, matching the Soviet maneuver, he risks confirming any suspicions the Soviet captain might have by creating a correlated movement that even a mediocre sonar man would recognize as evidence of a tail. Submarines do not randomly turn in the open ocean at the same moment unless they are following each other. But if Harper maintains current course and allows the bearing to drift, he will lose contact within 30 to 40 minutes as the Soviet boat opens range and disappears into the acoustic clutter of the North Atlantic. Harper chooses aggression masked by patience. He will match the Soviet course change, but not immediately. He will allow 90 seconds to elapse, enough time to break the temporal correlation between the Soviet maneuver and Amberjack's response, then execute his own turn to a pursuit course that will close the range slightly while maintaining the offset geometry that has worked so far. Helm, come right to heading 230 degrees. Make your speed 6 knots. Smooth turn, no rapid course changes. Make it look like normal navigation drift if anyone's listening. Harper's voice is steady, conveying none of the tension that comes with knowing this single maneuver might determine whether the mission succeeds or fails. Amberjack comes right in a gentle arc, her single propeller biting into the water with carefully controlled thrust. The helmsman uses minimal rudder angle to avoid creating flow noise across the control surfaces. In the sonar shack, Witten adjusts his tracking solution, compensating for own ship motion to maintain accurate bearing on the Soviet contact. The relative motion problem, determining the true course and speed of a target when your own platform is also moving, is one of the fundamental challenges of submarine warfare. The next 10 minutes are the longest of Harper's career. If the Soviet boat executes another radical maneuver, it will confirm that their captain suspects pursuit and is actively trying to shake a tail. If the contact settles back into steady transit, Harper can breathe easier, knowing the turn had been routine evasion rather than response to definite detection. 8 minutes and 40 seconds after the Soviet course change, the contact steadies on heading 220 degrees and reduces speed back to 7 knots. Harper allows himself a controlled exhale. Routine evasion. The Soviet captain is following a pre-planned route designed to complicate any trailing solution, but he has not definitively detected Amberjack. The hunt can continue. But the Soviet maneuver has consumed battery capacity at rates Harper had not planned for. The higher speed required to close range during the turn drew current from the batteries at nearly double the normal rate. 6 minutes at 6 knots instead of 4 knots might not sound significant, but in the brutal arithmetic of battery-powered submarine operations, those 6 minutes have cost Harper approximately 45 minutes of total endurance. His comfortable 18-hour estimate has just become 16 hours, and every subsequent maneuver will consume more of that dwindling margin. Before we continue this underwater chess game, take a moment to subscribe to Cold War Chronicles. We explore the hidden conflicts that shaped our world, uncovering the technology and tactics that kept superpowers locked in silent competition beneath the waves. The Soviet submarine continues westbound, settling back into what appears to be steady transit profile. Harper orders the crew to 4-hour watch rotations, allowing men to rest in shifts while maintaining full coverage of all essential stations. The sonar watch changes, with Petty Officer Second Class Michael Torres relieving Witten. The new sonarman settles into his headphones, studying the waterfall display, learning the specific acoustic signature of this particular Soviet boat, so he can detect the smallest change in operating profile. Torres is 23 years old, from San Diego, and has been a sonarman for 4 years. He has spent hundreds of hours in training simulators, learning to distinguish submarine signatures from biological noise, from geological sounds, from the complex acoustic environment of the ocean. But this is only his 3rd time tracking a real Soviet submarine, and the first time the contact has been held for more than a few hours. His hands are steady as he adjusts the game controls, but Harper can see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes fix on the waterfall display with almost religious intensity. By hour 6, clear patterns are emerging in the Soviet submarine's behavior. The boat maintains course and speed with almost metronomic consistency, suggesting either very precise navigation or possibly autopilot control of steering and propulsion. Every 90 minutes, almost to the minute, the contact executes a minor course change of 5 to 10 degrees, zigzagging in a pattern that would complicate any fire control solution, while allowing the Soviet sonarman to clear baffles, the blind spot directly astern, where the submarine's own propeller noise masks incoming signals. Harper uses these predictable maneuvers to his advantage, timing Amberjack's own course adjustments to occur during the Soviet zigs and zags, when any sound Amberjack generates will be masked by the target's own machinery transients. It is submarine hide-and-seek played at the highest level of professional competence, a game where the penalty for losing is not embarrassment, but potential international incident and the loss of intelligence capability that has taken years to develop. The hours accumulate with the slow inexorability of battery drain. 6 hours becomes 7. 7 becomes 8. The crew settles deeper into the rhythm of extended submerged operations. Minimal movement, quiet conversation conducted in whispers, the constant background hum of ventilation fans struggling to circulate air that grows increasingly stale despite the best efforts of the CO2 scrubbers. The temperature in the boat rises slowly as body heat from 23 men accumulates in the confined spaces, and the cooling systems work to balance thermal signature against the need to remove heat from the interior. In the galley, the cook prepares sandwiches in silence, avoiding the clatter of metal utensils that could transmit through the hull into the water. The menu is cold cuts and bread, nothing that requires cooking or generates food odors that would make the already marginal air quality worse. Men eat at their stations, maintaining watch discipline even as fatigue begins to accumulate from the extended period of heightened alertness. Coffee consumption increases. The head sees constant quiet traffic as the crew processes the coffee and the drinking water they consume to stay hydrated in the warm, dry air. By hour 9, Harper faces his first serious fatigue management problem. Lieutenant Commander Marsh reports that 2 members of the engineering watch are showing signs of exhaustion, slower reaction times, minor errors in logging procedures. Harper makes the decision to pull them off watch early and replace them with men who have had more recent rest. This reduces his reserve, manpower, the pool of fresh crew he can draw on if the pursuit extends beyond 12 hours. But immediate performance matters more than theoretical future needs. The battery state of charge has dropped to 62%. Harper updates his calculations again. At current drain rates, factoring in the reserve power he must maintain for contingencies, Amberjack has approximately 7 more hours of tracking capability before he will be forced to break off contact and proceed to snorkeling depth regardless of tactical situation. 7 hours might be enough, or it might not. Everything depends on whether the Soviet submarine surfaces or continues this steady underwater transit. At hour 10, Torres reports a subtle change in the target's acoustic signature. Con, sonar. Sierra 1, showing slight reduction in machinery noise. Estimate possible reduction in hotel electrical load. Could indicate they're securing non-essential systems. Harper considers the implications. If the Soviet submarine is reducing electrical consumption, it suggests their captain is also managing battery endurance, which means the Soviet boat is also diesel-electric rather than nuclear-powered. This supports the Zulu-class identification, but it also means both submarines are now in a race against battery depletion. Whichever boat runs out of power first will be forced to surface or snorkel, exposing itself to detection. Harper has bet that the Soviet boat will reach that point first, but there is no guarantee. The pursuit continues through hour 11 with the steady, grinding tension of a marathon rather than a sprint. Harper stands at the chart table, plotting estimated positions based on dead reckoning navigation. Without the ability to surface for star sites or radio navigation fixes, Amberjack's position is approximate at best. The inertial navigation system, a complex gyroscope array, drifts by approximately 1 nautical mile for every 8 hours of submerged operations. After 11 hours, Harper's position uncertainty is nearly 1.5 miles in any direction. At hour 11 and 42 minutes, the Soviet submarine's behavior changes again in a way that sends Harper's tactical assessment into immediate recalculation. The steady 7-knot transit speed drops to 4 knots. The contact descends from 150 feet to 230 feet, dropping below the seasonal thermal layer into colder, denser water, where acoustic propagation characteristics change dramatically. Torres reports the depth change immediately, his voice betraying slight concern at the tactical implications. Harper understands what is happening. The Soviet captain is either conducting a pre-planned passive sonar search, slowing down and going deep to minimize own ship noise while listening for any trailing contacts, or he has decided to lie quiet and see if anyone is following close enough to be detected during the slowdown. Either way, it is a tactical challenge that requires careful response. Harper orders Amberjack to match the depth change but maintain slightly higher speed, 5 knots instead of 4. This will gradually close the range over the next hour, but the closure rate will be slow enough that it should not create an obvious sonar signature. Make your depth 230 feet. Maintain current course. Reduce speed to 5 knots. Slow deceleration over 2 minutes. I want this to look like natural drift, not a tactical maneuver. Amberjack descends slowly, the hull groaning slightly as the external pressure increases. At 230 feet, the pressure is approximately 100 pounds per square inch, well within the submarine's test depth, but enough that the crew can hear the subtle sounds of the pressure hull adjusting to the load. The temperature drops as they enter colder water. Condensation on the bulkheads increases. For 2 hours, hours 12 through 14 of the pursuit, both submarines move slowly through the deep Atlantic, engaged in a silent battle of nerves and technical competence. The Soviet sonarman is undoubtedly listening, searching for any anomaly in the ocean background that would indicate a trailing contact. Torres is doing the same, monitoring the Soviet boat while simultaneously listening for any indication that the Soviets have detected American presence. The tension in Amberjack's control room is physical, a weight that presses down on every man present. Harper stands at the chart table, hands flat on the navigation charts, staring at the plot without really seeing it. His mind is running through contingency plans. Marsh monitors the battery status, watching the indicators drop with mathematical inevitability. 54%, 52%, 50%. At hour 13, Harper authorizes a brief meal service, sandwiches and coffee delivered to all watch stations. Men eat mechanically, fuel for bodies that are running on adrenaline and caffeine. The cook reports that fresh water consumption has been higher than planned. If the pursuit extends beyond 16 hours, they may need to reduce water rations. Harper notes this but does not act on it yet. Water is a problem for tomorrow. Today's problem is staying undetected long enough to identify the target. At hour 14 and 27 minutes, the tactical picture changes with sudden, dramatic clarity. Torres reports contact ascent. Con, sonar, Sierra 1 ascending, current depth approximately 190 feet and shoaling. Rate of ascent consistent with controlled rise to periscope depth. This is it, the moment Harper has been waiting for. If the Soviet boat is coming to periscope depth, it almost certainly intends to surface or at minimum raise a snorkel to charge batteries. Either way, it will be vulnerable, exposed, potentially photographable if Harper can position Amberjack correctly. But the opportunity comes with risk. Periscope depth means shallow water, where sound propagation is different, where the risk of visual detection is much higher, where a single mistake could expose Amberjack to counterattack. Harper moves to the periscope well, already planning the observation approach. He will bring Amberjack shallow, trailing the Soviet boat by approximately 2,000 yards, close enough for optical observation through the periscope, but far enough to avoid visual detection if the Soviet lookouts are competent. He will raise the periscope for minimum time, 30 seconds maximum, taking photographs quickly before dropping the scope and going deep to avoid counter-detection. Make your depth 80 feet, slow rise, maintain current speed. Prepare to come to periscope depth on my command. Photography team to control room with the periscope camera mounting. I want this on film before he knows we exist. The photography team consists of a second-class photographer's mate and his assistant, both carrying the bulky periscope camera adapter that allows standard 35mm film to be exposed through the periscope optics. The camera is already loaded with high-speed black and white film, the only type that will work in the low light conditions of dawn observation. The photographer checks his equipment with practiced efficiency: film advance mechanism, shutter operation, lens focus ring. Amberjack rises slowly through the water column, ascending into the zone where grey dawn light penetrates from the surface, where periscope observation becomes possible, but where the risk of detection increases exponentially. Harper grips the periscope handles, waiting for the precise moment when Amberjack will be shallow enough for observation, but the Soviet boat will not yet have lookouts topside if it surfaces. Torres calls out depth readings: 150 feet, 120 feet, 100 feet, 90 feet, 85 feet. Depth 80 feet, sir. Trim satisfactory. The diving officer's report confirms Amberjack is holding steady at periscope depth. Sonar, what's the contact doing? Contact at periscope depth, bearing steady. No significant change in acoustic signature. Estimate range 2200 yards, based on signal strength. Harper does the mental geometry. 2,200 yards. Just over a nautical mile. At that range, the periscope optics will provide clear observation, even in marginal light conditions. But it also means Amberjack is close enough that any mistake will be immediately obvious to Soviet observers. At 0647 hours, 16 hours and 5 minutes into the tracking mission, Harper gives the order. Up periscope. Quick look, photograph, and down. Make it fast. The periscope slides upward through its well with a soft hydraulic hiss. The massive tube rises through the pressure hull, through the sail structure, breaking the surface with minimal wake. Harper rotates the optics, scanning the bearing where sonar holds the Soviet contact. For 2 seconds, he sees nothing but grey ocean and greyer sky. Then, exactly where the solution predicted, the Soviet Zulu-class submarine is surfacing, water cascading off its hull as it blows ballast tanks and rises into the cold Atlantic dawn. Through the periscope optics, in perfect morning light filtered through low clouds, Harper sees exactly what NATO intelligence has been searching for. The Zulu-class hull is unmistakable. The characteristic double-hull construction, the tall sail structure, the diving planes mounted on the sail rather than the bow. But this is not a standard attack configuration. Integrated into the sail, visible even in the low morning light, are 2 vertical cylindrical structures that can only be missile launch tubes. The tubes are approximately 2 meters in diameter, with hinged covers that are currently closed. The configuration matches intelligence briefings Harper received about the Zulu V variant. 6 boats converted from standard attack submarines to carry SSN-4 SARC ballistic missiles. I have visual confirmation. Zulu-class, ballistic missile variant. 2 vertical launch tubes visible in the sail structure. Start photographing. The photographer beside Harper clicks the shutter in rapid sequence, the motor drive advancing film with a quiet mechanical whir. Each frame captures a different angle as Harper slowly rotates the periscope. Hull configuration, sail modifications, launch tube doors, equipment layouts visible on the deck, antenna arrays. Every photograph is intelligence gold, visual confirmation of capability that will allow Western analysts to build complete technical assessments of Soviet ballistic missile submarine design and deployment patterns. Harper allows himself 22 seconds of observation, longer than doctrine recommends, shorter than he wants. Through the periscope, he can see Soviet sailors emerging from the forward hatch, beginning the process of rigging the boat for surface running. None of them look toward Amberjack's periscope. The sea state is working in Harper's favor. 3-foot swells that make the small periscope wake virtually invisible against the natural wave pattern. Downscope. Make your depth 200 feet. Course 280, speed 8 knots. Silent routine. We're done here. The periscope retracts smoothly. Amberjack's bowplanes angle down, and the submarine slips back into the depths. Behind them, on the surface, the Soviet submarine crew goes about their battery charging operations, completely unaware that American eyes have documented their most sensitive capability from less than 2,000 yards distance. But the mission is not yet complete. Amberjack must escape the area, reach safe waters for snorkeling, charge her own depleted batteries, and transit back to Key West with the film that will prove what they have accomplished. Harper does not allow himself the luxury of celebration. If Soviet lookouts spotted Amberjack's periscope during those 22 seconds of observation, the Soviet captain will immediately radio for assistance. Soviet Naval Aviation Patrol aircraft could be overhead within 40 minutes. Sonar, report all contacts. I need to know everything in the water within 10 miles. Torres studies his display with renewed intensity. Con, sonar, Sierra 1 on the surface, bearing changing slowly left to right as we open range. Faint diesel engine noise indicates he's running one engine to charge batteries. No other contacts on passive sonar. Ocean background normal for this area. Harper calculates rapidly. The Soviet submarine remains on the surface, suggesting the observation went undetected. But Harper cannot assume safety. He must put distance between Amberjack and the Soviet boat, while conserving enough battery power to reach snorkeling depth in international waters. Navigator, plot a course to the nearest point where we can safely snorkel. I want us in international waters, away from known Soviet patrol patterns, with sufficient ocean depth to dive deep if we're compromised. The navigation officer spreads charts across the plotting table. Sir, recommend course 295 for 42 nautical miles. That puts us west of the Reykjanes Ridge in deep water. At current speed, approximately 5 hours transit time. 5 hours. Harper looks at the battery status indicators. Current state of charge is 41%. 5 hours at 8 knots will drain approximately 25%, leaving 16% when they reach the snorkeling position. That is cutting it extremely close. Reduce speed to 6 knots. That extends our transit time but improves our battery margin. Plot a track that keeps us below the thermal layer and away from major shipping lanes. The first hour of the escape transit passes without incident. Torres maintains sonar watch, monitoring for any indication that Soviet forces are searching for them. The ocean remains quiet, except for natural background sounds. The Soviet submarine they tracked for 16 hours has faded from sonar range, still on the surface charging batteries, apparently unaware of the American boat that documented their capabilities. At hour 17 of the overall mission, Harper faces a new concern. The air quality in Amberjack has degraded noticeably. The CO2 scrubbers are working at maximum capacity, but 17 hours of 23 men breathing in a sealed tube have elevated carbon dioxide levels to the point where crew members are reporting headaches and slight dizziness. Engineering, increase ventilation fan speed to maximum. I know it creates more noise, but we need to circulate the air more effectively. We're far enough from the contact that the additional noise is acceptable. By hour 18, Amberjack crosses into international waters according to the navigation plot. This provides a degree of legal protection. If detected now by Soviet forces, Amberjack can legitimately claim to be conducting routine operations in international waters. Prepare to come to snorkeling depth, up scope for visual observation, confirm clear surface, raise the snorkel, run one diesel engine at maximum charging rate, clear the interior atmosphere, then get back down to safe depth. Total time on snorkel, maximum 30 minutes. At 08:47 hours, 18 hours, and 5 minutes after initial contact with the Soviet submarine, Harper gives the order. Make your depth 60 feet. Prepare to raise snorkel. Amberjack rises slowly toward the surface. At 60 feet, Harper raises the periscope for a careful visual sweep of the surrounding ocean. The dawn has given way to full morning, grey and overcast with low clouds. Visibility is approximately 3 miles. The sea is empty. No ships, no aircraft, no visible threats. Clear surface, raise the snorkel. The snorkel mast extends upward, breaking the surface with its distinctive twin pipe design. The head valve opens and the diesel engine starts with a deep, rumbling roar. The engine drives the main generator at full output, pumping electrical current into the depleted batteries. The interior fills with the smell of diesel exhaust, acrid, but also the smell of power being restored. Men breathe deeply despite the fumes, grateful for the fresh air displacing the stale atmosphere. At 15 minutes on snorkel, the batteries have climbed to 58% charge. Not full, but sufficient for tactical flexibility. The interior air quality has improved dramatically. Harper makes the decision to secure snorkeling and return to safe depth. Secure snorkeling, lower snorkel mast, make your depth 200 feet. come right to course 300. Harper retires to his cabin for the first time in 18 hours. Before sleeping, he drafts a message that will be transmitted once Amberjack reaches waters where radio communication is safe. Mission successful, primary objective achieved, positive visual identification, photographic evidence obtained. Returning to base, no compromise. Amberjack sends. That message, once transmitted, will trigger a cascade of intelligence analysis. The film will be developed in secure facilities. Photographic interpreters will examine every frame. The analysis will inform NATO's strategic planning for years. If this deep dive into Cold War submarine operations inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to Cold War Chronicles, and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, or if you have family who served in submarines during the Cold War. Every like and comment helps share these forgotten stories with more people who need to hear them. This is Cold War Chronicles. We preserve the memory of those who hunted in silence beneath the waves. 3 days later, Amberjack approaches Key West under brilliant Florida sunshine. The crew has cleaned the boat, secured equipment, prepared reports. Harper stands on the bridge as Amberjack makes her approach. From a distance, the boat looks like any other guppy submarine returning from routine patrol. Nothing suggests this boat has just completed one of the most successful intelligence-gathering missions of the Cold War. As Amberjack secures to the pier, Harper sees the intelligence courier team waiting. They take possession of the film within minutes. The film will be on an aircraft to Washington within the hour. That evening, Harper and his crew gather for the traditional post-patrol dinner. Steak and lobster. The conversation is subdued. Harper raises a glass. To the crew of Amberjack, to 18 hours of professional excellence, to the mission we will never be able to talk about. The photographs will have significant impact on American intelligence assessment of Soviet ballistic missile submarine capabilities. The intelligence will inform naval force deployments throughout the 1960s. But the value extends beyond immediate intelligence gain. Amberjack's successful tracking demonstrates that guppy-converted diesel-electric submarines retain significant capability. The mission validates the guppy conversion program. The crew will eventually receive a Navy unit commendation, though the citation will reveal nothing specific. Harper will be promoted to captain 2 years later. USS Amberjack will continue serving until decommissioned in 1973, having served 27 years. For Commander Thomas Harper, the 18-hour hunt will be the defining moment of his career. The patience to trail a target for nearly a day without error, the judgment to know when to take risks, the technical knowledge to maximize capabilities while respecting limitations, the leadership to keep his crew focused, the courage to operate in contested waters where detection could mean death. These are the qualities that make submarine commanders successful. These are the skills that win the silent battles of the Cold War. The ocean is vast and dark and unforgiving. It has no memory of the submarines that transit its depths. But the men who fight those battles remember. They remember hours of patient stalking. They remember tension of operating on dwindling battery power. They remember satisfaction of mission success and relief of safe return. USS Amberjack's 18-hour hunt in October 1959 represents one small engagement in a conflict that spanned 4 decades. But for the 23 men who conducted that mission, the mission was anything but small. It was perfect execution of submarine warfare at the highest level of professional competence. This is Cold War Chronicles. If you found this account compelling, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for ensuring that Commander Harper, his crew, and all those who served aboard USS Amberjack are not forgotten. The photographs remain classified even today. The mission files are sealed in secure archives, but the achievement endures. USS Amberjack tracked a Soviet ballistic missile submarine for 18 hours without being detected, obtained visual confirmation and photographic documentation, and returned safely with intelligence that influenced American naval policy for years. That is the definition of mission success. That is the legacy of USS Amberjack and the men who served aboard her. That is why we remember, why we preserve these stories, why we honor those who fought the silent battles that kept the Cold War from becoming hot. In the vast darkness of the North Atlantic, in waters that have long since erased any trace of the submarines that passed through them in October 1959, the memory remains. Commander Harper, tracking a Soviet submarine with skill and patience. Petty Officer Witten, watching his sonar display without error. The crew maintaining silent discipline. The photographer capturing images that would inform strategic decisions. These are the moments that define naval history. These are the achievements worth preserving. These are the stories that must not be forgotten.